My name is Alessa Farinella, and I'll be presenting biases from MAE-ToBI intonational transcription conventions in the intonational analysis of African American English. And this is joint work with Christine Yu and Lisa Green of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Elena Brugos of Boston University. In this talk, we'll highlight 3 intonational patterns we found in African American English, or AAE. We'll show how they raise multiple hypotheses about the intonational phonology of AAE, and we'll open a discussion about the possibilities we might consider in the analysis of these patterns. Here we're assuming a systems and patterns approach to AAE. Under this approach, AAE is characterized as a variety with distinct features, including intonational features, that are entwined with structures of mainstream American English, or MAE. While there is overlap among varieties of AAE, there can also be variation within communities and among speakers within a single community. For this reason, it's useful to think about AAE as existing along a continuum, where speakers as well as communities of speakers can be at different places on the continuum. We're focusing on a particular community of AAE speakers in this talk. The data for this study come from a small, rural, and mostly working-class town in southwestern Louisiana, which is fairly homogeneous. The white and black community members have historically been segregated, and there's little migration into or out of the town, so the variety of AAE spoken here is fairly stable. And these speakers, we could say, fall a little closer to D on this continuum. We want to acknowledge variation within AAE at the outset because the aspects of intonation in AAE covered in this talk might not be present in all varieties of AAE. So in other words, there's a potential for intonational variation within AAE. But here we're going to be focused on the variety spoken in the community our data come from. This is an example of embedded inversion produced by an AAE speaker from the Southwest Louisiana community.
Rhonda wanted to know, could the operator move the box a little closer?
In this kind of structure, the auxiliary in the embedded clause comes before the subject in an embedded yes-no question. It's a typical AAE structure, but one that's not common in MAE. In the MAE gloss underneath, the auxiliary comes after the subject. And we can visualize what this sounds like by isolating the pitch contour. This is what it looks like. And this is just what the pitch sounds like without any words. So when we talk about intonation, the primary acoustic correlate we speak of is fundamental frequency, which is the rate of vocal fold vibration. It's the highs and lows and the rises and falls we perceive as pitch. And here we'll be using the terms fundamental frequency and pitch interchangeably. So we have a series of highs and lows creating rises and falls, and this is what we look at when we analyze intonation. What we just did in the previous slide, marking the highs and lows, is the beginning of a prosodic transcription. Prosodic transcription allows us to separate the phonological units of intonation and start to analyze the intonational phonology of a language. Prosodic transcriptions, though, are more than just sticking in highs and lows. They're language-specific and based on knowledge and assumptions about the intonational phonology of a particular language. So because of this, prosodic transcription is also a phonological analysis. So what exactly is MAE-ToBI then? It's a prosodic transcription system, which is essentially a set of conventions for analyzing intonation in MAE. And the original conventions were published in 1994 and updated in 1997, but it's been continually revised and changed. MAE-ToBI is just one of many prosodic transcription systems out there. There are different systems that have been proposed for different languages, for different varieties of English, and there are even different proposals for a single variety of English. There are also other types of transcription systems being developed, one of which is Polar, and this will be discussed further in Nicole Holliday's talk, also in this session. There have been several additions suggested for prosodic labeling more generally beyond just MAE-ToBI, and these include the addition of an alternative tier for noting places where there are alternative choices available, and a proposed method for marking disfluency. So remember we put in the highs and lows on the pitch contour earlier, but there's more to a prosodic transcription than this. The tones themselves are the units of analysis, but we can further divide them into 2 different types based on how they dock and what their function is. The first type of tone is a pitch accent. These are associated with stressed syllables, and we tend to think of them as marking prominence. Here are 3 trisyllabic words spoken by me with stress on a different syllable in each. In the first, there's stress on the first syllable, Melanie. And you can hear and see that the high comes on the first syllable because pitch accents follow stress. In the second, stress is on the penultimate syllable, Marina. Again, you can hear and see that the high comes later in the word and is timed closely with the penultimate syllable. In the last example, there's stress on the final syllable,
Marianne.
and now the high comes even later in the word. And you'll notice that there's also a low coming at the end of each of these words. This low is due to the second type of tone, an edge tone, which I'll discuss shortly. So we've just discussed the concept of a pitch accent, and there are several main, and these are the main types of pitch accents in the inventory of MAE-ToBI. There are lows and highs, as well as two rising pitch accents, this low plus high star and low star plus high. The tone with the star diacritic is the one that's most closely timed to the stressed syllable. But note that falling pitch accents, the high star plus low and the high plus low star, are not present in the tonal inventory of MAE-ToBI. So this is the same utterance that we heard earlier.
Rhonda wanted to know, could the operator move the box a little closer?
Using the pitch accents that were just introduced in the inventory of MAE-ToBI, this is how we might label it. And you'll notice here that some of the highs look pretty tiny, but this is just because they're next to very large rises. The second type of tone is called an edge tone, and they're just what they sound like. They're associated with edges of a prosodic chunk called a constituent. Unlike pitch accents, they don't follow stress and will stay at or near the edge. I'm going to play the same three names, but this time spoken with a list intonation. So there's a high edge tone at the end of the name. Once again, the first name has stress on the first syllable, but the high comes at the end.
Melanie.
The low in this case comes from a pitch accent, and in the first name that starts on the stressed syllable, the first syllable. The second name has penultimate stress, so the low is on the penultimate syllable, but the high is still at the end.
Marina.
And the last name has stress on the final syllable, so the low and high are realized on the same syllable, but the low is a pitch accent and the high is coming from the edge.
Marianne.
So as mentioned just now, we have edge tones, which mark constituent boundaries. There are two types of edge tones in MAE-ToBI. We have phrase tones, which are marked with the minus diacritic, and we have boundary tones, which are marked with the percent sign. And they would appear at the edges, both of these tones would appear at the edges of constituent chunks. Within MAE-ToBI, there are two levels of prosodic phrasing. We have intermediate phrases, which are the smaller prosodic constituents, and that's what we use the phrase tone for, the one that's marked with the minus diacritic. So these are all intermediate phrases. And we also have an intonational phrase, and that's the larger constituent. We use the boundary tone to mark the edge of that. And as you can see in this example, within an intonational phrase, we can have several smaller intermediate phrases.
Melanie, Marina, Marianne, and Bob. No one else came.
In MAE-ToBI, we also mark the strength of the boundary with the break indexed here. And there are numbers between 1 and 4 indicating the size of the juncture. So 1 is the smallest and 4 is the largest. So here we have 3s marking the edges of an intermediate phrase and 4 marking the edges of an intonational phrase. And cross-linguistically, there are certain cues we might expect at a boundary. In addition to the tonal cues, they include pauses, lengthening of the pre-boundary syllable, and pitch reset following the boundary. And larger prosodic constituents should show stronger boundary cues. So you can see, and you probably heard, that following the intonational phrase, following the word Bob, there's a much larger break there than following the intermediate phrases. So putting together what we've seen so far, this is a sample ToBI annotation. We have the waveform at the top, the spectrogram with the pitch overlaid on top underneath it. There's a tonal tier, the words tier, and then below that there's a break index tier, which, as I just mentioned, is used for indicating the size of the boundary. There's also a miscellaneous tier for the annotator to mark any comments or uncertainties, and there's an alternative tier where the annotator could propose alternatives when it's not quite clear which tone type to choose. So following that background on intonation and the way we annotate it in MAE, we can discuss intonation in AAE and some of the ways that it's been described as differing from MAE. So it's long been noted that there are differences between intonation in AAE and MAE, some of which are listed here. Recent phonological studies of intonation in AAE make use of MAE-ToBI, and it's a starting point, but MAE-ToBI wasn't developed with data from AAE. And as I mentioned earlier, these transcription systems are highly language specific. We're not the first to question whether using MAE-ToBI to analyze AAE might cause us to miss certain features of AAE intonation. Holiday 2021 raises this concern as well. We can, however, use MAE-ToBI to make progress toward a phonological analysis of AAE. Identifying places where there's a lot of uncertainty, for example, heavy use of the alt tier, a lot of comments in the miscellaneous tier, might indicate where we're missing generalizations and provide clues to help develop a phonological analysis. So in this talk, we're going to be discussing 3 intonational patterns. The first is a high pitch accent followed by a sharp fall, which you can see in 1. The second is a rise-fall pattern in declaratives, which I've shown in 2. And the last is going to be an initial high pitch followed by a compressed pitch range shown in 3. And we'll just be discussing each of these in turn. The data from this study come primarily from a small rural town in southwestern Louisiana. Details about the town these speakers are from was discussed at the beginning, but recall that it's a fairly homogeneous community of AAE speakers. The utterances were elicited with written prompts with situational context presented auditorily and visually, yielding about 800 tokens. Recordings were then segmented and force aligned and transcribed following MAE-ToBI conventions by one transcriber with extensive training in MAE-ToBI. And for a fuller description of the speech community and methods, you can see our related work from the last N-Wave. That work looks specifically at the prosody of remote past bin in AAE. This work uses the same data, but we're also looking at other types of utterances beyond just bin constructions. So here we introduce the first case study. It can be described as a high pitch accent followed by a sharp fall. The example shown here is the same utterance we've been looking at and listening to up until this point, but just the first half, because we're focused on that rise fall in the beginning.
Rhonda wanted to know,
We need a way of explaining where this fall comes from. So one option within ToBI is to say that it's due to a phrase tone, an L-. The L- is used to mark an intermediate phrase boundary, so under this analysis, the fall is coming from the boundary. But the transcriber also put an L- after the word no. And when we compare the break after no to the break after Rhonda, the break after no looks and sounds much larger than the break after Rhonda.
Rhonda wanted to know,
To indicate the difference in the strength of the boundary after Rhonda and after no, the transcriber marked the break after Rhonda with a 3- on the break index tier. The use of the minus indicates that we don't see all the cues we might expect at an intermediate phrase boundary, cues like final lengthening and pitch reset, among other things. So if this were a kind of sporadic occurrence, we wouldn't need to be too concerned that the cues to an intermediate phrase boundary don't all line up in this case. But examples of a 3- break index were quite common in our data, and this graph shows the frequency of a 3- in our data set. So you can see that it's quite common. And this indicates that it's possible that the phrase tone account is missing a larger generalization here. So one option to address the lack of cues to a boundary is to hypothesize that AAE has a smaller constituent below the intermediate phrase, called an accentual phrase, or AP. In this kind of analysis, we would still analyze the fall as owing to a phrase tone, but this time a phrase tone associated with this smaller AP constituent. So the difference here is in prosodic structure. We add an additional level of phrasing below the intermediate phrase. And this idea was proposed by Cole, Thomas, Britt, and Cogsall at an earlier N-Wave back in 2005. Because the AP is a smaller constituent, we don't expect to see all of the same cues to a juncture as we would for the intermediate phrase. So this analysis amounts to saying that there's a difference in prosodic constituent structure between AAE and MAE, with AAE having an additional level of phrasing below the level of the intermediate phrase. So that's one option to address the lack of cues to juncture seen in these types of utterances with sharp falls. Another option is to say that there's no juncture at all, that the L isn't marking a boundary, but instead the fall is due to a falling high star plus low pitch accent. And recall that a falling pitch accent is not an option in MAE-ToBI, but clearly it's a possibility that could work here. And this possibility is discussed by Gusenhoven for English in general. It does away with the entire phrase tone category and adds falling tones to the inventory of English. So one implication of this analysis of utterances of this type in AAE could be that AAE has a different tonal inventory from MAE, and that it has falling pitch accents, where MAE only allows rising pitch accents. But another is to say that AAE makes a case for a falling pitch accent in American Englishes, but that maybe this tone type is more frequent in AAE. So this hypothesis instead attributes the fall to a pitch accent rather than a phrase tone. Now, could we ever tell which is the right analysis for AAE? Well, there are different expectations for the analysis that treats the fall as a phrase tone and the analysis that treats it as owing to a falling pitch accent. And perhaps a way of disentangling these two would be to look at cases where we have a following high pitch accent and ask where we see the rise to high. It would be especially useful to test this with words where stress is far from the right edge of the word, so say in words with antepenultimate stress. Under the phrase tone analysis, that's the one that's drawn out on the left, we would expect the rise to start only after the end of the word. But under the falling pitch accent analysis, in words with antepenultimate stress, we would expect the rise to start earlier after the penultimate syllable. And we're planning a controlled study like this to answer these and other questions. So our next case study looks at declarative utterances that end with a rise fall. So we're looking at the last part of this utterance.
I told him it's a book on the bed.
So the rise is captured with a rising pitch accent, an L plus H star, and the fall is due to a low phrase accent boundary tone combination. L plus H star is often, but not exclusively, used for contrastive focus in MAE. This is not an instance of contrastive focus here. And Holiday 2016 and McLarty 2018 note the greater frequency of L plus H star among AAE speakers in their studies. So it's possible that L plus H star carries a different meaning in AAE compared to MAE. But another thing we might want to ask is, how is this rise perceived? Do listeners perceive the word bed as prominent? If not, it's possible that this rise could be coming from the phrase rather than the word. So in other words, it could be owing to a type of boundary tone rather than a pitch accent. But an issue here is that there's no real way to capture a rise fall at the end of an utterance in MAE-ToBI except with a combination of pitch accents and boundary tones. But even if the rise is not signaling prominence, it could still be a pitch accent. We tend to think of pitch accents as prominence marking, but it might be that these types of pitch accents don't always signal prominence in AAE. Our last case study looks at utterances with a sentence initial high tone.
They would have been got rid of Doug Rose.
This example comes from the Corpus of Regional African American Language, or chorale. And this initial high is something we noticed in looking at remote past bin constructions in chorale. It seems to be a feature in many of these types of utterances. It also appears in the remote past bin constructions looked at in Weldon 2019 and 2021, which look and sound very similar to this one here. In MAE-ToBI, an initial high boundary tone is an optional possibility, but in the 1997 guidelines, transcribers are urged to avoid transcribing an utterance with an initial high boundary tone, and it's referred to as an analysis of last resort. So MAE-ToBI encourages the use of pitch accents over initial boundary tones wherever possible. But similar to the last case study with the rise fall on the word bed, we might want to ask whether listeners perceive the word they as prominent.
They would have been got rid of Doug Rose.
Anecdotally, we found that speakers of AAE don't always perceive this type of rise as prominent, but we need to test this further. So while convention suggests that this should be marked as a pitch accent, it's not clear here that that's what the analysis should be. And this perhaps signals that the intonational phonology of AAE differs from MAE, and that in this variety, initial boundary tones are a feature of the grammar. So this is one of the ways that applying MAE-ToBI to the study of varieties of English whose intonational phonology has not been fully described is extremely useful for making progress, because we can start to see areas where they differ. And I also want to note that this initial high is very high, but there's not a good way of capturing pitch range in MAE-ToBI. In Polar, the transcription system that was mentioned earlier, the pitch ranges are also marked. So this is a promising avenue to explore for the study of intonation in AAE to see whether a difference in pitch range is also meaningful. And this could potentially be a way of understanding similar findings from earlier studies of AAE speakers, which found that they tend to have a greater pitch range and make more use of falsetto. And these last two case studies connect to a larger issue in work on intonational phonology, which has to do with the separation of tones into these discrete categories of pitch accents and edge tones. There's been a recent questioning as to whether this distinction works for all types of utterances in all languages, and there's some good evidence that this divide might be too rigid. We saw that it's not entirely clear whether the high in the last case should be analyzed as a pitch accent or an initial boundary tone. If the high is not marking prominence, we can question whether that precludes a pitch accent analysis or not, because pitch accents might not mark prominence in all cases in all languages. Data like these from AAE can be brought to bear on these foundational issues in intonational phonology. And this is just one example of the many ways that theoretical linguistics and work on varieties that are less well studied in terms of their intonation, like AAE, can inform each other. So to sum up, we've seen that MAE-ToBI is useful for capturing generalizations about intonation in AAE. It can help us find patterns and identifying the places where the analysis is not so straightforward. So for example, where the annotator has a lot of uncertainty or where there are multiple possible hypotheses can help us make progress toward the study of intonational phonology in AAE. And one point we really want to drive home is that prosodic transcription is also a phonological analysis, which means that there are always alternative analyses that we can and should consider. Doing this type of work on AAE and other varieties whose intonation we don't know as much about compared to MAE has the potential to shed light on this current debate over a fundamental issue in intonational phonology, namely the questioning of the rigid divide between pitch accents and edge tones. Thanks for listening.